Okay, good morning and a good Yontif. Hey Teves. So I'll dedicate a few words here to this day. Tonight also we have a Fabrengen here, as you probably all were notified. I think 8 p.m. Okay, so every year this question comes up again and again. And I hear it both from insiders and outsiders. What's the significance of this day? And even hardcore Lubavitchers, whatever that means, but sometimes have difficulty explaining, like, why is this Yom Tov? Why do we celebrate year after year? Even if that first year, Tavshim Mem Zayin, 36 years ago, it was significant because a court case was won, and we saw the Rebbe's palpable aggravation, and then, of course, relief and simcha. Okay, that was a one-time thing, but what makes this into a permanent annual holiday? Yutas Kislev, we know, was not just about the Alter Rebbe being imprisoned and then being released. Because that too, if it was just that, it would be an individual thing, and maybe for Chassidim. But Yom Tes Kislev is called Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. It's called Zeh Yom Tchilas Masecha, considered the Chag HaGeula, the beginning of your Futzmai Nesecha Chutzah, because the imprisonment was just how it was Lamata, down below, but in truth there was a challenge in heaven to the very method that the Alter Rebbe was using to spreading Torah, Chabad, Chassidus. And then when Yutas Kislev happened, that vindicated. So it's a far more than just a one-time event. This became forever a Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. But how do you explain that in the context of Hey Teves? And I find that many, and I challenge even you, everyone here and everyone listening, if you had to explain this to someone you meet in the street who doesn't know anything about Chabad or about the Rebbe or about Chassidus, how would you explain why is Hey Teves such a significant day? I assure you that many will have difficulties explaining it because many of us don't understand it ourselves. For some, it sounds like somewhat of a family feud even, that the Rebbe had a nephew, Barry Garari, who stole books, feeling that it's his own private property, being a Yiddish, an heir, a grandson of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe opposed that, and the Rebbe won. But that makes it a very personal thing. And to be perfectly blunt, many people have asked me, so that's what we're celebrating, that the Rebbe won over his family member, a nephew, that the Rebbe was victorious. Obviously, it's a lot more than that. It's far beyond that. Because then again, it wouldn't be just a permanent thing. Just because there's a disagreement in a family, don't turn it into a yontif. And we all know that it was not exactly easy as well. There was a lot of, as I mentioned, aggravation. So each of you have to do your own soul searching of figuring out how you explain this. I understand when we speak to each other, it's like it's a given. Hey Teves, a Yom Tov, let's celebrate. Fabreng, we know that Rebbe made the Didan Notzach of the Sfarim, so you have to buy Sfarim and learn in Sfarim. That was, of course, a big component of it. But that alone tells you more that there's more going on here than meets the eye. Because if it was just, again, a disagreement, why is learning the Sfarim so critical? I mean, it happened, then it's over, and the aggravation is over. And frankly, why shouldn't even want to remember it? It's too problematic. So that's what I would like to address and try to answer this question. Obviously, I was here 36 years ago. I was a full-blown adult. I was working the Sichos of the Rebbe, so I was pretty much in the center of things, Teich and Yonim, as they say. Just Agav happens also to be my birthday, Hey Teves, in case you're interested. Not that is the key message here. I turned 30 years old that day, Tavshim Mem Zayin. And And I remember my mother had called me to wish me Mazel Tov, and we were on the phone around 11:30 in the morning. I was sitting in my office at the top of 770 Anochas, which is the office on the second floor. 2 flights up. And it's like the closest office actually to the Rebbe's room, to Frierdiker Rebbe, with our windows right across the Frierdiker Rebbe's apartment and the Rebbe's and Gan Eden Hatach. And suddenly, while we're talking, my mother, we both hear that they're singing in the streets. So my mother says to me, "What, people are celebrating your birthday?" I said, "I don't think anyone knows it's my birthday." And then we found out that was when the verdict came out, and therefore they were dancing. So, Megalgung schus liyem zake, I guess we can say. But getting back to the events of the time, so even then it was not so clear. It was clear that this meant a lot to the Rebbe. And if you hear the Sichos in Memhei, when the news first broke in the Fabrengens and Sichos, the Rebbe spoke Yud Beis Tammuz and then Tezvav Tammuz, and subsequent to that summer, under Pasha Bolok and Pasha Pinchas, unbelievable Asias. No one ever heard such words from the Rebbe, talking about really very blunt and very powerful words about what happened here. And so it was very clear that it was significant. But to say that everybody could explain exactly why, no, it was more like the Rebbe felt this was a piyah in the malchus and leadership of the Rebbe. But the full gravity and the full understanding of it, I think we can appreciate a lot more today, specifically after Gimel Tammuz, which maybe explains also why these events, Kavyochel, had to happen this way. So there's a note that I have here in front of me, a zettel from the Rebbe. Here's the Ksav Yad, actually, copy of the Ksav Yad. You may have seen it. If you want, I can give you a copy afterwards. I can post it. Where the Rebbe, in the process when he was talking to the lawyers and to the secretaries and to the people involved in the court case, he was explaining what the argument should be. Because look, we have a real situation here. The Frierdiker Rebbe was definitely a Rebbe, of course, but he was also a private citizen. He had a family, he had children, he had a place he lived, an apartment, he had possessions, he had belongings, whether it's his clothing or his furniture or his books. And it would make sense to anybody that a person passes away, so there's Yorshim, al pi Torah and al pi secular halacha. Meaning, I should say al pi Torah and halacha and based also on secular law. It's a thing called Yerusha. What does a child inherit? Their parents' belongings, money, and so on. And from a child it goes to a grandchild. So in concept, you can argue, okay, here's a grandson. Everyone agrees that he was a grandson. No one disagrees with that. So he believes that part of it belongs to him, not all of it, but a partial, especially his mother was alive. She was the direct daughter of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So what's the argument against that? Again, we're not talking about Gzeira Gezarti because the Rebbe said so. We understand. But you have to also make a case. You're standing in front of a court. You can't just say the Rebbe says this is not right. That's not enough legal grounding. So the Rebbe very much was involved in the whole process of explaining what the reasoning was. And that whole period of time during the court case, the Rebbe gave instructions. In addition to instructions, he also wrote sometimes notes. This is one of the notes he wrote for the secretaries and for the lawyers to make part of the case to the court. Now, when you read this settle, it's really a deep piece in Chassidus. And to be truth be told, I think some people at the time wondered, is this something you can present in a Goyish court to a judge who's not even Jewish, Judge Sifton? Is this a case you can really present? But the Rebbe did write it, and after the fact, we see the significance of this note, among other things as well. So I'm going to base what I'm saying based on this settle, as well as some other important information. The Rebbe also said, Motzei Shabbos, Teruma, when he spoke after the Rebbetzins Histalkus in Memches. So one of the things the Rebbe said, that the Rebbetzins' words were like a linchpin, a cornerstone of the case. When the Rebbetzin was asked, so who, at the end, after her long deposition, who do the Sfarim belong to? Who do your father's books belong to? So she answered, to the Rebbe or to the Chassidim. And she answered, the Rebbe himself belongs to the Chassidim, so the male of the Sfarim also belong to the Chassidim. Which, if you think of it, is quite a statement. And again, you could say it's a Chassidish hergish, but it ends up becoming the foundation in many ways of what Sifton ruled in the case of Hey Teves, that made the Agudas Chabad victorious over the opposition. So from these things you see that this is not just a matter of a personal or a family thing or Yerusha thing. There's something far more fundamental here. So here's the story. Sifton, in his judgment, in his ruling, if you read it closely, he clearly was a brilliant man, and he looked at it from an objective point of view. He's not a chassid, he's not even Jewish, and he's looking at it as what are the legal facts here? So he states very clearly that the issue here is that until the 20th century, there was no legal question about the relationship, and this is the key, relationship between a Rebbe, his Chassidim, and the Rebbe's belongings, like his books, his library, and so on. Why? Because there was fundamental trust, and we're talking about from the time of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe and the Chassidim never wrote a contract with each other. There's no legal contract, not a shtar api halacha, not a secular contract. It was a fundamental trust between Chassidim and the Rebbe, and their so-called agreement with each other, and it was based on love. It wasn't like the Rebbe could demand that the Chassidim love him or give him money or other things. And the other way around as well. They completely trusted and they completely gave the Rebbe that authority. Again, not legally. And that was how it went for generation after generation until, this is what he writes, I'm just paraphrasing, that until it came the 20th century approximately, the end of the 19th, with the upheavals, would change the whole dynamics, because no longer living in Lubavitch or Liozhne or Liadi or in Shtetlach, where it was all insulated and that trust was the key thing in the relationship. So now the Frierdiker Rebbe, in his wisdom, anticipating and seeing what's happening, felt the need to establish this in legal terms. And that's the question facing the court. What is the legal relationship between a Rebbe, his Chassidim, and his books? So one argument goes that the Rebbe is a Rebbe, but he's also a private citizen. So the things that is a private citizen, he owns property, he owns books, he owns other possessions, and therefore the laws of the land, as I said also, laws of the Torah apply, that some of it should go to his children and grandchildren. It's an inheritance. On the other hand, the argument that Agudas Chabad, the plaintiff, was making is that no, the Rebbe bought the books with the money given to him by Chassidim, didn't buy the books for his own private use. It was as a Rebbe of Chassidim. So he's basically the overseer, the administrator, if you wish. I don't remember the words they used exactly. But essentially the caretaker, trusted by the Chassidim. So it's not like the Rebbe can take that money and then go ahead and say, okay, I'm giving it to my children. No matter what child, it's not private property. Public property, essentially. Interestingly, Sifton rejects both arguments. Both, Agudas Chabad too. He rejects the argument of this case, the defendant, Bar Gerari, because he says it's very clear that the Rebbe in his letters and other ways communicated that the books were not just his private property, they were property of Agudas Chabad. And he, of course, didn't accept the argument that that letter was, God forbid, just l'chutz. The Rebbe was just playing games. This is part of what the Rebbe's settle, which we'll soon go review in a moment, is about. So he rejected that argument. On the other hand, he said the Rebbe is not just a caretaker. The Rebbe is totally trusted. If the Chassidim give the Rebbe money, they can't come back and say later, hey, you know what, we don't like how you spent the money and bought the books, and we want you to buy different books, or we want the books back. It's not that way. A caretaker is that way. You hire somebody to, let's say, run a kuppah, so yeah, he answers to the people who are paying him. A Rebbe was totally trusted, which means once the Rebbe took the money and the Rebbe bought the books, he can do whatever he wants with them. He wants to give them to his children, he can give them to his children. So to say he's just a caretaker is also not like an administrator or a CEO, whatever the words you want to use. I don't remember the words Sifton uses. And what's the Sifton then go to? Okay, so then what do we do? If it's not this and it's not that, what's left? What other option is there? So here is where, in some, the Rebbitzon's words, and the words in this note, you suddenly realize it's power. And it's a power that mamish, I mean, you could say, I don't call it a miracle in a way, maybe it is a miracle, but it's definitely quite amazing if you think about it, because it wouldn't seem like it would be a legal case. A legal case is what I just said. Is it private property or not private property? But he was margish, he sensed that you can't just say a Rebbe is a so-called a gizber, it's just overseeing the public domain of the public library, which means that he doesn't really have any power. It's just he's being trusted by the people. And he goes back to the words of the Rebbitzin. What did she say? She added a new thing, that the Rebbe himself belongs to Chassidim. That's a tremendous concept. That's not that he's a caretaker. It means his whole mahus, his whole mitzias is not himself. He's fundamentally not a private citizen. But on the other hand, he's not just an administrator. He's a Rebbe. And he's completely trusted by the Chassidim. But his whole mahus, his whole being is connected, it belongs to the Chassidim. So there's no such thing as private property in the first place. It's not like he said, okay, I took the books and now I'm using it for my own use, or I'm using it for Chassidim. The whole reason there's a Rebbe in the first place is because for Chassidim. I mean, I'll just use words that the Sifton doesn't use, but there's a concept in halacha called sibur ein emes. What does that mean? It means that an individual, every person in this world, before Mashiach comes, passes away. Just a chetei tzadas. And b'meila, what you have is yours while you're alive. Afterwards, it has to go through Yerusha or other ways that is passed on. But a sibur ein emes, why? Because a sibur is not made up of one individual. It's a concept that is higher than any individual. And that lives on. Let's just use an example. Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu also had children. Imagine his children coming and saying, after the stalkers of Moshe, hey, you know what? Moshe kibul Torah Sinai. Torah tzivilanu Moshe. We're his children. You want to learn Torah, you have to pay us royalties. A penny every time you have you open up a chumash. We all know that's ludicrous. Why? Because it's not Moshe's Torah. It's the Eibishter's Torah. At the same time, Moshe is the Eibishter's person. Say, Zichru Torah's Moshe Avdi. Torah is Nikras al Shmei. Because Moshe is not a Metzias for himself. It's not his Metzias and his children are going to take over. The Torah that's passed through Moshe is a Dover Nitzchi. And that ain't a mess. That's not shaykh to a private individual, including Moshe. So essentially what Sifton was ruling is that the Rebbe is like a Moshe Rabbeinu. And just like Torah, which is also Svarim, they not belong to the Rebbe personally, they belong to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe belongs to Chassidim, because Moshe and the Torah all were given to Klal Yisrael. And that can never be transferred to any individual. No one can. It wasn't the Rebbe was claiming, like some people think, that the Svarim belong to me and not to you. Because the Rebbe on a legal basis is also a Sachakel, a son-in-law. I'm not minimizing it, I'm just saying from a legal point of view. But it's not about the Rebbe as a son-in-law. We're talking about the Tanu of Lubavitch, that the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, that's why the Rebbe in the Tezvav Tammuz Sicha was so adamant when he said, it's hard even to repeat, basically saying that the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away in Tafshin Yud, and that's that, and it's over. So now let's distribute and separate his belongings, his books, and so on, which means it doesn't live on. And by the Rebbe, the whole thing was that the Beferish lives on. And indeed, if you would argue that Chassidus Chabad, as the Rebbe brought several times, that their taina was that it's not active. Chabad is not active. I mean, it was the words were on the Gudis Chassidus Chabad. Then absolutely, if that's the case, if Chabad stopped, God forbid, functioning in Tavshin Yud, and saying suddenly in Tavshin Mem Hey, now you want to have the books, where's the Chassidim? That's why by the Rebbe, no, the Chassidim never stopped. And of course the Rebbe himself is the Rebbe. We're continuing the Tanu of Chabad. That never dies. And the whole concept of a Rebbe belongs to Chassidim, so b'meila it all is nitzchi. So in one summation, you know what Hey Teves is? The nitzchius of a Rebbe. The nitzchius of Chassidus. The nitzchius of Chassidim. That's what Sifton came to conclude. And that is very unique. You're not going to find, I didn't find anywhere. I don't think there's any court of law or any precedent that an individual on earth should not be considered a private citizen. President of the United States, lahavdil, as much as he's a president, he also has private property. He's also a private citizen. But here, this concept, which means that it lives on, and it lives on through the Tnu of Chassidus and Chabad, through the Sfarim which capture the ideas of Chassidus Chabad, or even if they're not about Chassidus, but it's the Sfarim of the Rebbe that he uses when he looks into the Sfarim to teach and to learn and to fabreng. So all that lives on. That's why in the Sikha Vayikra, Tov Shemem Zayin, we'll fabreng about this later tonight more, the Rebbe writes there, that the Sikha there says very clearly, he brings the story of the Frierdiker Rebbe when he was 4 or 5 years old. And he talks about that he went into, he was playing in the room, the Chedi Yechidus. This is the Frierdiker Rebbe tells a story in the first Maimer, Reishis Goyim HaMolek, Tov Reish Pei. So this is the first Maimer the Frierdiker Rebbe said after the Stalkos, the Hilula of the Rebbe Rashab. Yeah, he was playing in the room, the Chedi Yechidus. And then he sees his father walking in, the Rebbe Rashab. And his father's dressed with a kapote and with a gartel and the ganze levush, as if he was going into Yechidus. And he goes into the room with the same place where the Rebbe Marash would sit. Now we're talking about 4 or 5 years after Mem Gimel, Tafresh Mem Gimel, so we're talking basically Mem Tes or something like, or less, Mem Ches. I think he says 4 or 5 years old. And he says he was standing by the table and speaking as if it was B'chaim Chayusi of the Rebbe Marash, without any shinui. And the Rebbe Frierdiker Rebbe explains, because Achai of Tzaddik is Chaim Nitzchim. And not just him, but his table and his chair and his room and all his chafetzim, meaning all his belongings, are all nitzchi. And he explains al pichsidis, like the kelim of Atzilus. Not just the eris of Atzilus, but the kelim of Atzilus is kedusha le'zazim im kema. So even the kelim, the very kelim of the Rebbe, are also part of an extension of him. Because you could say the Rebbe's Torah continues, the Rebbe's ruchnius, yira, amuna, but his physical svarim, his physical table. No, but it's all kedusha le'zazim came, exactly like we speak about the Kaislam Arabi, the Mokam HaMikdash. You're not allowed to walk there, even though there's no Beis HaMikdash today, because kedusha le'zazim came. You can look at the Maimer, it explains it more in detail. And the Rebbe brings that in Vayikra Mem Zayin, which is just a few, Vayikra's Nisan Mem Zayin. So we're talking about a few months after Hey Teves. Clearly he was talking about this in you. So it's the Nitzchias that is the issue at hand. And if you think about it that way, frankly, it has nothing to do with Barry Garari altogether. It could have been anybody. It happened to be him. It wasn't about him, just like the story of Yutas Kislev was not about Avigdor. He was the guy, he was the protagonist, the one that mastered the Alter Rebbe. The story is a much deeper story, both L'mayla and Lamata, about the challenge. If this case had not happened, think about it, we would not have a legal precedent. What would happen after Gimel Tammuz? We have plenty of disagreements as it is. But hypothetically, this was not resolved. Someone can come after Gimel Tammuz. Let's just say, you know what, the Rebbe's library is worth $1 billion. Why don't we sell the whole thing and give every chassid on earth $100,000? I don't know. I didn't make the calculations. It's a nice gift. $1 million, whatever it is. Could that happen? The answer after Hey Teves, absolutely not. If there was no Hey Teves ruling, obviously I don't think anyone would go ahead and do it. I'm just speaking a hypothetical. But in Inyan, this has never been established. And with Sifton's ruling, and that's why the Rebbe writes in the Ha'ara. What does he write in the Ha'ara, in the famous Ha'ara, the Hey Teves Ha'ara? That B'yem Zeh established in a federal court that the Sforim belong to Agudas Chabad. What does that really mean? It means that a Goyish court, just like we talk about Yutas Kislev, what it would get to us that a Goyish court accepts that Agudas Chabad owns the books? But the same thing the Alter Rebbe writes in his famous letter, that B'yem Zeh Yutas Kislev, the Sari HaMedina and the Goyim recognized the hand of Hashem. So now it's established in Dinah Malchus Dinah that a Rebbe belongs to Chassidim and it lives on forever, and that can never change. It's Nitzchi, Le'elam V'ad. In a court case, in a legal court case. That is Hey Teves. And that's why it remains a Yom Tov all the time, because Think about it. That was never established till then. Yutas Kislev was what told us, the Geula, that Chassidus is meant to be taught, and the Alter Rebbe was vindicated in Chassidus Chabad, and Yad Chassidim al Yena, and we'd be successful, as we have been in the last 7 generations. But this establishes the Nitzchis of a Rebbe. So you have to, you don't need a lot of imagination to think that it was a form of Magdim Refuah L'Makom, because it happened in Mem Hey. I mean, the Psak was in Mem Zayin, the ruling. It just 5 years later would be Chav Zayin Adar. 7 years later would be Gimel Tammuz. And we have today a clear Psak, even in a Goyisha court, that a Rebbe is Nitzchi. Why is he Nitzchi? Because he belongs to Chassidim. Mazare b'chaim, afu b'chaim. Not because he's just Nitzchi. That's the word in Ageres HaKedesh, Shtakich Yatim b'chayui, because a Rebbe's life is not Chaim Psorim, Chaim Ruchnim. But that still doesn't answer the question, what about his books? What about his belongings? But when you say that the Rebbe belongs to Chassidim, you're saying that the Chassidim live on. And it's not one chassid, 2 chassid. The concept of Chassidim will always live on. And B'meila, like the Tzibur Ein Emes, and that is a Nitzchi, and the Sforim are part of that. So the case is a far, far deeper one. Now I can guarantee you that Barry Gerardi, when he took the books, didn't think about this. He wasn't like, I don't think, challenging the Nitzchis of a Rebbe, at least not consciously. You know, he needed money, so he went and took some books, but he happened to touch the wrong thing. Talking Eitzer HaMelech, not just books, it's not just his grandfather's books. You're talking about touching the Nitzchias of Chassidus. And I'm not trying to be Melamed Zchus or not be Melamed Zchus. I don't think this is about him, and I don't think this is about celebrating. The Rebbe was not celebrating the victory over his opponents. That's not the key here. The Rebbe was celebrating the victory of Chassidus, of Nitzchias, and so on. So with that in mind, and I just said it briefly, I'll talk about it more maybe if I bring tonight. I want to read this note. It's a Gvaldik Zettel. They could push to learn. It's like a Maimach Chassidus, actually. It's not long, but here's the Zettel. So I'm reading, here's the Lashon of the Rebbe himself. Now, just the context. This was in context because they had found that letter from Marx, who writes that, the Frierdiker Rebbe writes to him that he wants the books to be moved from Europe to America. It's not his books, it's the books of a good Chassidus Chabad. So here you have pretty much a smoking gun, absolute evidence that the Frierdiker Rebbe is Megala Daite. It's not my books, it's the books of a good Chassidus Chabad. The other side argued that the Frierdiker Rebbe did it to smuggle the books, he'll say whatever it takes. The Rebbe was so furious that he's called it Mamish a Merida B'Malchus. He even used the word Reish Mem Ches on it, because what, you're saying that the Rebbe is not truthful? Chaz v'shalom to say such a thing. And Sifton accepted that, to say that Rebbe would write a letter, L'Deirus, a published letter, that is not what he means. He's just doing it L'Ponim to get the books out, is absolutely not right. And therefore that letter became also a part of it. But the letter also tells you, it doesn't say there in the letter that Rebbe belongs to Chassidim, but the same idea, the Sforim are not mine, the Sforim are Gudish Chabad, and I represent Gudish Chabad, is the Chassidim. Similar to what the Rebbe said in Yud Alf Nisan Tov Shem Mem Hey, when the Rebbe spoke about his birthday. He said, "What? Everybody's coming to celebrate the birthday of one Yochid? It's like a Chere Hepecha Bittle, Hepecha Nova." The Rebbe asked that question on a televised Fabring Yud Alf Nisan Mem Hey, and the Rebbe answered the story that he told the story about this Rav that was hired in a Chashuv town. He was a Baal Mailas, a Talmud Chacham, every Mailas, but he was physically a short person. Pasha Begashmis, I could say, short person. So some of the town people felt, it's very good, you're a great man, but you're standing there, you're so short. That's not like Kovid Ha'ir, Kovid Ha'kehillah, Kovid Ha'tzibur. And he answered, the Rebbe told the story, that he answered, the mensch is klein, but the benkel is grace. The person may be small, but the seat he occupies, his position is big. So the Rebbe said it's not a celebration of an individual's birthday, it's a celebration of the tenuah that this individual represents. It's mamish, more or less a different aces, but the same teichen ha'inyanim. Now, we have no problem that the Rebbe as a yochid, that he's the nasi, and we're coming to, and everyone came to celebrate the Rebbe's Yud Alf Nisan birthday. Wasn't a question, but the Rebbe in his emes, he's telling it what the muhus of a Rebbe is. It's not about him. As much as we may honor him, because he is not about himself. Like Chassidus talks about a melech. You read Mitzvahs Minei Melech and Derech Mitzvah. What's a melech? His kol inyone is Bittle. And it's to bring Bittle to the people. That's why Shmuel HaNovi was so against when they didn't want a melech, because they didn't want it for Bittle. They wanted it for ego purposes, for other things. So here, with this background, let's read the Zettel now. So the Rebbe is writing this note, number one, to refute the argument that the Frierdiker Rebbe would say something not completely emes chas v'shalom. And more importantly, the Zettel gives out a deeper understanding of what a Rebbe is, which, as I said, is the key to the whole story of Hey Teves. So this is what settles from the few things that the Rebbe actually wrote, Mamish Ksav Yad Kodshe. So I'm reading the Zettel right now. And I'll explain it as what the time allows, but you'll see there's a lot to say here. So the Rebbe writes like this, Ki b'chol admurei Chabad. So he's talking about right now, he's quoting all the admurei Chabad. Not just the Frierdiker Rebbe, but all the Rebbeim. HaYesed HaRishon, what's the first foundation of a Rebbe? So the Rebbe, how many often do you get a description of a Rebbe by a Rebbe? So a Rebbe is telling us what a Rebbe is. Bittle hayesh. That's the Yesed HaRishon. Bittle hayesh. Bittle. We have to discuss why doesn't he write Bittle b'mitzias? If you know Chassidus, Bittle b'mitzias seems to be higher, but that's what the Rebbe writes. Bittle hayesh. Maschil ba'atzmei, in parentheses, which means that in other words, Bittle hayesh, not just to bring Bittle to his people and to everyone he meets, but it starts with himself. Ba'amitis. So ba'hisodishim Bittle hayesh maschil ba'atzmei ba'amitis. Period. So Bittle hayesh ba'amitis means be'emes. It's not just a superficial thing or chesenistic thing, it's be'emes. Continuing on. Heyese admur harizeh shlichus nafshis. I'm reading from a paper, I just want to compare it to the actual admur. Harizeh shlichusei nafshis v'ikris. So being an admur, that's his muhus. So this Bittle hayesh is his shlichus nafshis v'ikris. So how do we translate that? His soulful shlichus and v'ikris underlined, his primary shlichus. L'nahlom ula'edadom b'teira mitzvahs b'chlal maskil b'amunas Hashem shmiras hashulchan aruch v'chulu. Okay. So he's taking it further, that the Rebbe embodies Bittle hayesh, and being that this is a shlichus, so what is his role? Is to inspire, l'nalim, to guide, to lead, ula'edadam, and to motivate, and teira mitzvahs b'chlal. In other words, it's not here to just to compare. He's not a leader, he's not a business leader motivating people to run a business, or a military leader motivating an army or military. So his inyan is Bittle hayesh, which is Bittle Hashem. So that's what he does. He teaches his people and he guides them and inspires them and motivates them to serve Hashem. Amunas Hashem shmiras hashulchan v'chulu. Ula'areisam dugma chaya, and to show them a living example. B'zeh, areisam dugma chaya b'zeh, ad kedei mesiras nefesh b'peil. So this takes it even further. To mesiras nefesh b'peil, underline b'peil, which we know the Frierdiker Rebbe of course did. But the Rebbe is speaking again about all the admurim. So mesiras nefesh b'peil. So the Frierdiker Rebbe, is not just teaching them what to do, like he said before with Bittle hayesh. It's not just for the people; it's also himself. To the point of mesiras nefesh, upshita, and it's obvious and pashut. Upshita, lishlol kol pu'ula sheyuchla lites lefarsha lehepech. And definitely not to do anything, and to negate any action that can suggest a mistake, and to be interpreted the opposite, which is clearly indicating that the letter he wrote, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and everything he said was tachlis ha'emes, because he has to be a dugma chaya for Bittle hayesh, so it's not shy that he would do something, God forbid, that can be interpreted, and he really means something else. Very clear. Then the Rebbe adds the final line, la'achzeh, underlined twice. So in other words, after we've established that the Yesed HaRishon, and that's the shlichus nafshis v'ikris, Then comes his life as an individual. So the Rebbe is acknowledging, yes, there is a chayiv prati. The Rebbe had his private life. He had a wife, he had children, he had his home, things that he does like any melech. However, firstly, it comes after the ikir, and even that cannot be a stira. It's also a yisod. Like he said, the Yisod Arishan, that even his private life cannot at all affect or compromise l'geya klal b'tafkidei hakloli va'ikri. Underline that ikri. That's the tzedek. So, my introduction to this note already explained. What you take away from this is not just that the Rebbe is a ish emes and therefore would never write a letter that would be misleading or in some way inaccurate or just writing it for certain people, but it's not really the real truth. Chas v'shalom. That's for sure. But the Rebbe is going a lot further here. He's telling us what he calls the nafshis, the shlichus nafshis v'ikris of a Rebbe. Why was this so negated? And I can tell you that when this note was written, and I saw it then, some people were wondering, are we supposed to tell this to the judge? In a court, you're going to start explaining Bittle yesh, and Mesiras Nefesh, and Nafshis V'ikris, and everything that says here. You can explain that. We see from this, that Rebbe is emes. But you come away seeing here that there's a lot more going on, that Rebbe Kol Inyan is Bittle. I once heard an expression that they say the Rebbe said in Yechidus, was the only thing that when he was asked, Pshat and Hemshech Tzadik Daled, there's a very deep Hemshech from Friedrich Rebbe where he talks about difference between Ruchnius and Gashmius. So there's an expression there that says that Gashmius is Mitziyusei is not Mitzad Atzmei, and the Mitziyusei is not Mitzad Atzmei, and Muhusei is not Mitzad Atzmei. I think Mitziyus and Muhus, I think that's what he says there. Whereas in Ruchnius, Mitziyusei is not Mitzad Atzmei, because the Eibishter created Ruchnius too. But Muhusei is Mitzad Atzmei. I think the Lashon is Muhusei. So the Rebbe, what does that mean? What do you mean Muhusei is Mitzad Atzmei? So the Rebbe has a whole footnote there, giving example for Machzis HaShekel. Again, this is not for right now. We'll talk about this again tonight. But the Nekuda is that the Rebbe makes a point, and this is the expression I heard, which is unbelievable. Since Ruchni's Kol Inyan is Bittle, Gashmi is the opposite. The whole inyan of a Geshem says, Ani po, ani kan. I exist. The table, the chair, me. That's what Geshem is. If it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. So it needs to be tefes mokim. I don't just mean occupying space and time, but also occupying an ego, an identity. What's Ruchni is the exact opposite. I don't exist. All I am is Batul Hashem, like the difference between Eir and Yesh. Yesh says, I'm here. Eir says, no, I'm only reflecting the Moir. Eir Hashemesh. I'm a light that's carrying the Moir, the sun, into the world. In other words, my job is not me. I'm here to serve something higher than me. Essentially, the concept of Bittle. So the expression I heard was the Rebbe said, Bittle kenish bottle werden. That's why Ruchnius is Mehusim Mitzad Atzmei. Not Chaz v'Shalom that there's no Eibishter that didn't put it there. Its existence Eibishter created, but its personality is the more bottle it is, the more it exists. Because that's its whole Mehus. In Gashmius, if you're Mavatla al Geshem, then it stops existing. You take a piece of an object and you burn it, it's no longer that object. Maybe it changes into another form. But in Ruchnius, Bittle, Kenish Bottle werden. That's why Chassidus says that the Oyer is Me'en HaMoyer, and Kilu Kodma Heder. Only thing is the Oyer is not the Moyer, but the Oyer has nothing else but the Moyer. So in a way, just as the Eibishter, we say the Eibishter's Ein Sof, that's why Eir Ein Sof. And Eir does not mean Eir Shel Ein Sof, but the Eir itself is Ein Sof. Why? Because it doesn't have a Mitzias of its own. If it had a Mitzias of its own, then why would it be Ein Sof? But because it has nothing of its own, all it is like, think of it, Shluchish Alodim Kamese. All it is a Shliach of the Mishalech. So in that context, Bittul Kenish Bottle werden. So once you say a Rebbe is Bittul, it's Nitzchi. Kenish Bottle werden. There's no such thing as, I said before, it's Sibur Ein Emes. It lasts, it goes on, and especially through his teachings and through the Torah and through the Sfarim. That is one of the nukudas that you could take out from this from this note. And even his chayiv pratim, which there is an element of that as well, However, that also, the yesod is that it can't be negay, it can't be a stira. You can't say his private possessions is a stira to his tafkid, his role as a Rebbe. Now, one key final point. So now you can also understand what the Rebbe made such a ikir. How do you celebrate Hey Teves? Yutas Kislev you celebrate through Farbrengens, but the Farbrengens that we make in learning Chassidus and Hafotz Sameyonis Chutza. Hey Teves, the Rebbe said, is the Dan Notzach Shal Asforim, the Asforim. So therefore, since the Sforim are basically a non-nafshik sovis Yehovis, an expression of the Rebbe, an extension of the Rebbe, and the nitzchis of the Rebbe, so the only way to celebrate is, how do you celebrate the nitzchis of a Rebbe? By acting that way. If we sit around and do nothing, what does that mean? That was mamish going against the very essence of what Hey Teves is. Hey Teves declares that a Rebbe lives on, and he lives on through his Sfarim and through his Chassidim, and he belongs to Chassidim, but let's say the Chassidim go to sleep, and the Chassidim are not doing anything. Rahman al-Itzlan, in a way, we are testifying that the Rebbe is not active. In Tovshin Chavov, there's a very powerful Farbrengen, Yud Shvat, where the Rebbe teaches Amazar Rebbe Chaim, Afu B'Chaim. He said more or less these words, that until Tovshin Yud, the Shver, the Rebbe, the Shver, Frierdiker Rebbe, he controlled his destiny. He went where he wanted to go, he said what he wanted to say. He was the Rebbe. But after Tovshin Yud, because the Neshama is no longer in the Guf, so now Mazare B'Chaim. It's the Zare that determine whether the Rebbe is Hu B'Chaim or Chaz B'Shalom, the opposite. So if Chassidim don't do what they have to do in living up to fulfilling the Heiros and learning the Torah of the Rebbe, in a way, God forbid, the Hu B'Chaim is in question. That's why the Rebbe was so upset. Everybody knows when was the Beis Kislev? What day was it? When the Rebbe came out. And the Bochum were dreinzich, and the Rebbe started yelling. It was the Beis Kislev. Yeah. And if you look, you hear the words, everyone thought the Rebbe saying a sicha. We didn't obviously make hanocha from it. But the Rebbe was basically saying, with reitzach in the gassen, with zeil de fliegen, or the flieglach, counting flies, counting the birds, shos nachanan, hours after hours, and crying, the Dan Notzach. The Rebbe says, Flegich ba'ayich, I'm asking you, this is the Dan Notzach, dreinzich in the gas. The whole point is the nitzchias of a Rebbe and his Chassidim and his Sfarim and learning, and you dreinzich in the gas. Now the Rebbe would be upset any day that a bocher dreinzich in the gas and does nothing. There's a story they tell, just the Chvevusa de Milsa, in Tovshin, probably Tovshin, I don't know what, later years, what the Frierdiker Rebbe, Tovshin Ches, Tovshin Tes. I heard it from one of the Bochum that was there. So the Frierdiker Rebbe was not making many public appearances due to health. So the Bochum, especially the Bochum, most Chassidim never saw the Rebbe. Even Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, not everybody can get in. So it was a thing to see the Rebbe. And the Rebbe, Frierdiker Rebbe, would come out on the porch, the porch outside of 770, where they build a sukkah, there's a porch. There's actually a picture, you see the Frierdiker Rebbe sitting there with vines. So he would come out on the porch. And the Frierdiker Rebbe once said, "Memeint as gein chapen Luft, ich komme zachig sein der Aver." The Rebbe is not going to get some oxygen, some fresh air, but it's coming to mezachig to refine the Aver. So one day, the Frierdiker Rebbe was out on the porch, and usually it was closed up by vines, so you couldn't see the Rebbe. But for some reason, one of the vines split, parted, and you could see that Frierdiker Rebbe. Someone showed me exactly where you could see him from. On Eastern Parkway, you stand near the Rebbe's library, after 770 on the street, that angle, you could see the Frierdiker Rebbe. So when the word got out, you could see the Rebbe, you could imagine, people started gathering. It wasn't like the numbers we have today, but in Bedford and Dean, the Bochum came running because they heard, you could see the Rebbe. So there's a group of, I don't know how many, but a bunch of Bochum and Anash were standing and watching the Rebbe. They saw the Rebbe. Frierdiker Rebbe noticed that they're watching him, so he made with his hand that they should walk by. So they walked through the chutzner. Those days you can go through the chutzner to Union Street. So they walked through, and that was that. So they saw the Rebbe saw them. One bocher wanted to see the Rebbe again, Frierdiker Rebbe again, so he went around on Kingston Avenue, came back, and went again, second time. Okay, this is gefrelch, right? Anyway, they go back to yeshiva. The Frierdiker Rebbe went back into his house, apartment, and suddenly there's a call from the secretary to the yeshiva. Frierdiker Rebbe is saying that you should find the bocher that went the second time and tell him, that's the expression. Why is a bocher hanging around the streets? In other words, the first time you hear to see the Rebbe is one thing, but the second time is already, it's your own dreizach in the gassen. Just know that. So the Rebbe would be disturbed any day that a bocher, or for that matter, anyone, Bittle Teire, learning Teire, being mitzvahs, doing mitzvahs. But Hey Teves, the whole essence of the yontif is to see activity, to see that you're learning, to see that you're doing mitzvahs, that you're living up to the Rebbe's expectations. If you don't do that, the Hey Teves is like the Rebbe said, a chulcha v'tlula. That's what he said. It's a joke, and the whole Hey Teves loses its purpose. Then it fulfills what the other side said, that they're not active. Now, how much more so is this relevant today? Today, when Begashmis, you don't have the Rebbe. So now it's completely totally on us. So the message of Hey Teves is very clear. It's literally about demonstrating in Maisa, Machshava, Dibur, but really in Maisa Bepeil, that the Chassidus, the Rebbe, Chabad, lives on. And lives on not just in concept, lives on through the Torah, through the Sfarim, through the Bimekayim, the Heiros, that it says in the Sfarim, in Maisa Bepeil. That's the story of Hey Teves, at least in brief. I don't know if I'll say Yeshlem B'derech Hefsher. I think this is pretty obvious, but obviously there may be others have different interpretations, but this is the way I understand it and why it's so significant and important to us today. So may we use this day well, to the fullest, and as I said, we'll continue Farbrengen tonight. Hey Teves, 36 years. A good yontif, everybody have a good day.